Hi there. This is the second part of my commentary on Jonathan Pageau's interview with John Vervaeke from last year. The first part compared their solution to the meaning crisis. The second part is going to compare, to the best of my ability at this time, their worldviews with that of Robert Pirsig and other Pirsig comparisons as well. I've put some links below, but I think I need to include here a brief explanation of the metaphysics of quality. The metaphysics of quality is the outcome of the philosophical inquiry of the character of Phaedrus, who is a stand-in for Robert Pirsig. First into values in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and then into morals in Lila. The theory of reality is introduced in the first book and codified in the second. And the second book, Lila, was published almost 2 decades after Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So, as I will a few times coming up here, I'm going to quote McWatt, who is the fellow who is considered the expert in this field because he did get his PhD in the metaphysics of quality. Pirsig postulates that everything that exists can be assumed to be a value, although he divides value into 2 classes, as we'll see later. As his system differs from traditional Western metaphysics by making values the ultimate basis of reality, it should come as no surprise that this has relatively radical consequences for his depiction of reality. The notion of quality is first presented in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You can't define quality, but you know what it is. For example, Pirsig would have his students rate each other's papers, and they would all think the same papers were good, and they would all think the same papers were not so good, so that good is quality, and quality is something everyone knows. In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the narrator's alter ego, Phaedrus, who we know now is Pirsig before electroshock therapy, traces the problem that is besetting the West. You could call it the meaning crisis, and in both books you will see examples of what he thinks the meaning crisis is. It's infiltrated throughout. We're not going to go into that now. He thinks that the origin of the problem is the split in Plato, that Plato instigated in the Phaedrus dialogue from emotion from reason, with reason taking the upper hand. So because of the split, we now have on the one hand objectivity, reason, logic, and dialectic, and on the other hand we have subjectivity, emotion, imagination, intuition, and rhetoric. Basically, the split is classic versus romantic, or art versus science. Yet it had not always been like this. At one point, the notion of arete, or excellence, was at the heart of metaphysics. This was expressed by the sophist, and this is when Phaedrus loses it, when he discovers that this division occurred, when he discovers we've been wrong for 2,400 years. At least within the narrative of the book, this is what sends him to the psych ward. This whole thing is explored in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, with the narrator being confounded over romantic classic, and ultimately it's reconciled with Poincaré, with Northrop, Zen for sure, other influences, William James, pragmatism. From this exploration of the division between classic and romantic comes the need for Phaedrus and for the narrator to both explore the origin of this division as well as the compulsion to unite them. The result of this is the metaphysics of quality in Lila, which starts to crystallize for Phaedrus after a peyote ceremony. So I'm going to quote from McWatt again. The metaphysics of quality is a theory that perceives reality as being in an evolutionary moral order of intellectual, social, biological, and inorganic or chemical patterns. It gives intellectual patterns moral primacy, then primacy to social patterns, and then to biological patterns, and finally to inorganic patterns. It describes and explains the nature of reality in the context of values and patterns. Note, patterns are repeated, regular, or logical forms of order, methodical and or harmonious arrangement. So patterns predominate in this interview that's coming up. And so hopefully what I outlined made some sense, and if it doesn't quite, there's lots of resources to look up the metaphysics of quality. I'm going to include some links. The Wikipedia page is kind of incomplete, so look at these instead. But I really just want to, I want to do this video, so I cannot wait until I'm an expert in the metaphysics of quality to do it. Like Paul van der Klee said, we're working these things out in this great forum where we can get feedback. So this will be necessarily incomplete and imperfect, but I feel like we're sorting this out together.
Out of all of the information, and now people often don't quite get what this means because they equivocate between two different meanings of equivocation. There's a technical sense of equivocation, which is probabilistic relations in the environment that are available to us. That's very different from what we say when there was a lot of information in a newspaper article, where we mean there was a lot of meaningful content to us.
This notion is something we've seen before because it's something that has emerged out of neuroscience. And my first understanding of this was from, I think, Damasio, but Jordan Peterson has also mentioned this. One thing about Pirsig's work is it observes what neuroscience has been discovering since then, since his theory. That the way we operate in the world and the way we think we operate in the world are very different. And I'm going to say that the way we think we operate is logically, is classically, is with a basis in subject-object metaphysics. We think that this is real. The way we really operate emotionally with logic as the handmaiden of emotion can be much better understood with the metaphysics of quality. Vervaeke explains the problem of subject-object metaphysics, which is also interdisciplinary. It's an interdisciplinary problem he's found, that our objective knowledge of the world is too vast. There are just too many things, objects, to think about. So to focus our considerations on objects alone is not realistic. We need another way of understanding. This is exactly what the metaphysics of quality says. And remember that Pirsig was very influenced by William James' pragmatism.
And so part of the problem facing your brain is, out of all of this technical information, it has to select which information it's going to pay attention to and how it's going to convert that into meaningful information. So there's this tremendous selection problem, attention, and all the models of attention are about, well, how do we zero in on relevant information? How do we exclude or ignore the irrelevant information? And and people don't quite understand why that's so tricky, because you see, this is what you can't do. It's kind of like a Zen thing. You can't check all of the irrelevant information to make sure it's irrelevant, because that's combinatorially explosive. Yeah. That would be uncountably too long for you to do.
Right, you spend your life checking everything before you could decide.
Yeah, you couldn't get out of your room in the morning.
The word select is obviously going to have meaning for you if you've read Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Remember that the way quality emerges is described by the mathematician Henri Poincaré. Out of all the facts, the best one emerges. So you have to pay attention. You have to be looking for quality, not for the fact.
Which means when I'm acting, I have to try and pay attention to the effects. Problem is, I can't pay attention to just the intended effects of my behavior. Every year this happens. People go into an area where they know there is a gas, a flammable gas. It's dark, and they light a match.
The lighting of the match is a low-quality situation. Intellectually, you know there's gas in the room. Biologically, you need light. You have allowed the lower quality need, biology, to supplant the higher quality, the thinking. This is tricky in metaphysics of quality. It's the moral component, and we'll go into this later.
So there's this interlocking. You have to pay attention, you have to formulate your problems, and then you have to determine the consequences of your action in this dynamically interlocking relevance realization.
So this is the first mention of the concept of relevance realization in this interview, and Vervaeke himself relates this concept to Pirsig's dynamic quality, and he's calling it dynamic relevance realization here. This concept is probably the most relevant in terms of understanding what is quality, what has value, what you pay attention to.
You know, when I encountered your work, obviously I encountered it through this notion of the meaning crisis and zombies and everything. And then when I saw that you're working on relevant realization, I thought, wow, this is definitely what I've been thinking about, for years now. I don't come at it. It's funny because I don't come at it scientifically. I come at it really phenomenologically.
I get that.
And I think that
discuss the phenomenology with you.
Sorry?
And I said, and I do want to discuss the phenomenology with you.
Right. And so I think that my kind of, it's not my solution. I think it's the traditional, let's say the traditional Christian or traditional Orthodox solution has been to talk about hierarchy and to have this notion of attention and this focus on nodes, let's say these nodes of attention, and then there's a hierarchy of attention which manifests itself around, and then it kind of splinters and splinters into basically just kind of this chaotic potential that's there on the fringe. And so that seemed to me like that's how we experience the world. And because of that, it makes it possible for things to move, let's say, from the periphery into the center, and there's room for that to happen. And so like you said, you don't necessarily have to pay attention to the things that are on the fringe. They kind of exist as these monstrous, ambiguous forms. But then as they move closer towards the center, all of a sudden they start to take, their identity starts to clarify, let's say, and then they connect themselves to the nodes that are already there.
I've been thinking about this for a while, and this is also why I'm so drawn to these men's concepts. They have a dynamic undercurrent to their worldviews. They call it here relevance realization, but you can argue that underlying anyone who makes sense these days, the metaphysics of their views are not materialistic subject-object metaphysics. They are something like the metaphysics of quality, of value, an acknowledgement that we operate by sensing what is best. Remember Panksepp's seeking system. The world phenomenologically is very important here. So Pageau is describing again the dynamic expressed by Poincaré. The relevant facts emerge. The best fact is the one that unites all the information together, that connects it. When he talks about attaching the nodes that are already there, in the metaphysics of quality, this would mean uniting the quality static patterns. And we understand this connection with dynamic quality, with a flash of insight, we see the connection.
I tended to see a limited interest in science because I thought that approaching things phenomenologically was more useful for living your life. But then this whole cognitive science all of a sudden came on my horizon, and I thought, wow, it's very interesting because it can help people to understand the mechanisms of attention and then ultimately moving towards this notion of the sacred, which I hope is something we'll get to talk about.
So here I argue that this realization is something like the unification of classic and romantic. Here Jonathan Pageau sees how the classic, or one 21st century iteration of the classic, cognitive science, can, if he integrates this into his understanding of how the orthodox worldview works, it actually helps him. So it's that uniting factor of classic and romantic.
And I see it as much more dynamic, simultaneously bottom up and top down. Think about when you're reading, right? You're building the words out of the letters, but you're also disambiguating the letters in terms of the word. So you're doing both simultaneously, bottom up and top down. So I tend to talk about what I call a salience landscape. You're very focal to me right now. You're a peak in my salience landscape, and then there's this dynamic topography that is constantly shifting around in various ways. And I don't just mean visually, also, your working memory, how you're tapping it, and that's all contributing to what you're finding salience in this very sort of textured and dynamic topography that's constantly unfolding and shifting. And I think a lot of what consciousness is doing is exactly creating a kind of perspectival knowing within that salience landscape.
So here Vervaeke is describing a model that aligns with metaphysics of quality, bottom up and top down. Bottom up is dynamic quality, top down is static quality, emotion, cognition. And the brain is structured like this, in fact. The emotional center is lower and the cognitive center is higher. Again, what is best, what is salient, what is the most meaningful at the time changes, but quality stays the same. It's not the objects. These are secondary. These move in and out of the pattern, with quality in the center or at the top of the hierarchy, with static patterns coming in and out of purview, and what propels this attention is quality.
Like if I was going to use like a traditional image, let's say that I tend to address to, is that there's a constant exchange between heaven and earth, you could say.
Yes.
Right. So it's like earth is constantly offering food and offering potential, right? And then heaven is constantly trying to embody ideas into the earth. And so it's like there's really this exchange of two sides.
Static and dynamic quality. Static is earth, dynamic is heaven.
The consonance between this is, Jordan would be happy. He would think this was synchronicity everywhere.
The synchronicity reaches even deeper than this. Now Pirsig is on board, so hopefully I can do him some service, maybe to the best of my ability, integrate him into this conversation.
How that actually plays into the work I do on relevance realization is I talk about the idea of sets of top-down and bottom-up constraints that are regulating our sense, that are sort of shaping and regulating the space within which this salience landscape is occurring. So our brain is putting a lot of top-down selective pressure to try and be as efficient as possible, but the brain also has this aspect that's bottom-up.
Yeah,
it's trying to create as many, try to keep as many options open as possible.
Right.
And between, so it's very analogous, and this is intended to Darwin's biological theory of evolution. The brain opens up variations, and then it narrows them down, and it's constantly, right, the sensory motor cycle is constantly being dynamically shaped.
So regulating and shaping. Here's a graphic from Pirsig, and this is the 4 levels of evolutionary static patterns, from inorganic to intellectual, and them being transformed, integrated, and is activated by dynamic quality.
In the story, when Christ talks about the sheep and the goats, you have this notion of bringing closer and pushing away. And so as you bring closer, you bring towards unity and towards meaning, towards oneness, and as you push away, you move things out towards fragmentation and fire, or whatever, how you want to image it. And so those two tendencies at the same time, this left and the right eye or hand playing together, are what kind of bringing together and separating. I always say that this idea in the creation of the world, that the notion that the logos comes in and he both separates and unifies, and it does it at the same time. Because when you give something an identity, you're both separating it out from everything around it, but you're also unifying it as an identity.
So this describes the analytical knife.
It's this dynamic thing that's constant. And the thing about that, Jonathan, is that leads to complexification. So what makes me a complex being? Think about it. We all start out as zygotes, right? Right. And then initially all we do is the cells just reproduce. But something really interesting happens, right? The cells start to differentiate. Some become lung cells, some become eye cells, and then they literally self-organize, right, into organs. And so you've got, in parallel, the cells are differentiating, but they're also organizing into organs and to systems.
This describes the mechanism of evolution and how on one level, organic, will eventually become intellect. Remember in Lila, it took carbon molecules becoming sufficiently complex to start to produce life. Life is biology. Biology eventually becomes complex enough to produce social patterns, and social patterns produce intellectual. So this complexity is the mechanism of evolution, and also in metaphysics of quality.
Before our very eyes, you've got Justin Trudeau saying diversity is our strength, and you've got Donald Trump saying, make America great again. And so you've got these two extremes, and people can only see the positive of their extreme. They don't understand that you need both. You need both unity and diversity at the same time in order to have something, in order for something.
Static patterns are abstracted from dynamic quality. Stuff doesn't conceptualize unless you have that exchange.
To be. And I tell people that sometimes people wonder in the Christian tradition why we have the Trinity. And the Trinity is the infinite representation of those two things together. The notion that you need, in reality, the highest image of all things is both absolute unity, completely one, and then at the same time completely three or completely multiple at the same time without contradiction. And so it's really an image of how the world works, basically.
The Trinity is a paradox, and it makes no sense unless you see the underlying pattern. It makes no sense in subject-object metaphysics. But if you see the pattern, it does. A person can't be one and many, but a person can be united by one concept and divided by another. The archetype of this is Christ. He unites us in God, and he divides us as being man in the world, but he is also God. Again, static and dynamic quality. This is the mechanism of the Trinity. So let me quote McWatt again to elucidate this a little bit. Though we do appear to have our own independent existence, ultimately we are connected with the whole universe. This is why Pirsig's metaphysics uses the mystic term dynamic quality to denote the one, and the philosophical term static quality to denote the many. Dynamic quality refers to ultimate reality, which includes absolutely everything, while static quality refers to the intellectual constructions derived for pragmatic purposes from this reality. Hence the phrase, the one is in the many, and the many in the one.
See, what's in Augustine, right, for me, what you see is you see this deep interpenetration, and this goes back to Plato and Plotinus, between love and reason. They're completely interdefining, interdependent. Yeah. And what's happening in Aquinas, and then pushed by Occam, is that no, it's separated, right? There's the natural world is grasped by reason, and then the supernatural world is grasped by love.
So Vervaeke says Aquinas is to blame for this division. Pirsig says this starts with the Phaedrus dialogue in which emotion and reason are separated. I'm no philosopher, and I don't really have any kind of background in philosophy, but I expect it's the analytical knife. Both of these are reasonable ways of seeing the origin of the problem. They've just divided them up slightly differently. And Vervaeke does share this problem with Pirsig. Like I said, you will find evidence for Pirsig's feeling that there is a meaning crisis throughout both books, and that there needs to be a solution. This ends up being why we have a scientific worldview in which we don't belong. And Pirsig says this is the ghost of reason. Vervaeke uses the word will, like it becomes, rather than experience, it becomes will, that emphasizes this separation. And this notion of will is very interesting, and I'd like to know more about it.
One of the things, in a normal, like in the traditional world, you would have these cycles, right?
Yes.
And so I know that you talk about how Christianity is more linear and moves towards, let's say, the eschaton, but there is in Christianity there's both movements. Like there's the cyclical movement of the liturgical year, and then there's this movement towards the eschaton. But the eschaton is also it's circular to an extent, in the sense that it's a return to the garden, but then it's the expansion of the garden into the totality, let's say.
So listen to what Pageau says about both movements simultaneously. And to elucidate this, I'd like to read another quote from Pirsig. The Metaphysics of Quality says, as does Buddhism, that the best place on the wheel of karma is the hub and not the rim, where one is thrown about by the gyrations of everyday life. But the Metaphysics of Quality sees the rim of karma as attached, or the wheel of karma as attached to a cart that is going somewhere, from quantum forces through inorganic forces and biological patterns and social patterns to the intellectual patterns that perceive the quantum forces. In the 6th century BC in India, there was no evidence of this kind of evolutionary progress, and Buddhism accordingly does not pay attention to it. Today, it's not possible to be so uninformed. The suffering, which the Buddhists regard as only that which is to be escaped, is seen by the Metaphysics of Quality as merely the negative side of progression towards quality, or just as accurately the expansion of quality. Without the suffering to propel it, the cart would never move forward at all. I think that's an interesting distinction. So you see value working here. What is affectively better is propelling the cart. Think Panksepp again, the seeking system, seeking what's better. Note the integration of classic into romantic, science into spirituality. Pageau integrates the Eastern cyclical and the Western Neoplatonist metaphysics. One is cyclical, one is linear. And it does seem like orthodoxy does integrate East and West.
And you have to be connected to yourself and to other people so that you are a relevant actor within it. And we aren't. That's what we just said a while ago. We don't fit into the arena that science presents to us.
Well, there's a kind of salience, which I mean, traditionally would be called desire. I mean, would
Yeah,
be
sure.
called passions, let's say.
Yeah.
And so that type of salience, which is the attaching oneself to some passion, then that's exact. I mean, that's a real. It's real in the sense that it feels like it gives you life, let's say, that it enlivens you, but then it ends up disconnecting things from each other, and so that's like the traditional. I'd say, I know you said you don't know a lot about Orthodoxy, but in Orthodoxy we have this notion of the entering into the heart, like this hesychastic anthropology, where your desires are on the edge and they pull you, but they're not bad, but they're meant to be connected together, kind of moving towards this central place where the illumination happens.
And this is what Pirsig would call a platypus, a problem of trying to live within subject-object metaphysics. It doesn't actually work. It doesn't reflect phenomenological reality. And by ignoring the reality of the subjective, by not considering it real, we are disconnected. And with that disconnection, you see quality in things that don't have it. You put the focus on objects. The illumination spoken about here is a connection with quality in the metaphysics of quality. This point, what he's saying, points to sacrificing intellect for lower levels, and this is where immorality or dysfunction occurs. Again, this is my weak point in metaphysics quality, so anyone who can help me out with this one, please do.
Part of the meaning crisis is this increasing sense of bullshit. And by the way, here's what I would want to argue. When people talk about being in a post-truth era with Trump, post-truth is just a euphemism for bullshit.
Yeah.
Right? And we're in an era, like you track the complaints, the worry, the concern, and these two are locked together. The prevalence of bullshitting and the increasing capacity for self-deception.
Yeah.
I think what happens when salience is all that's left.
This is low quality. Also a moral problem. We are convinced that lower quality static patterns, these exciting objects, are as important as higher quality ones. But we choose the lower level patterns at the expense of the higher ones. And this is the definition of bullshit. It's low quality. We are fooled by our drive, which we have innately, this drive towards the better, but without understanding what quality is, without being connected to it. Now here's a situation which seems like a low-quality situation, but actually isn't. It's when Phaedrus goes home with Lila, the bar girl. Phaedrus hasn't hurt anyone, so why is Rigel so worried? Why is his friend Rigel thinking that this is such an immoral situation? Rigel thinks that Phaedrus has chosen lower quality biological patterns over social, but Phaedrus ultimately determines that this false morality, this Victorian morality, which Rigel still retains, is outdated. It's outdated Victorian social pattern that needs to go. Ultimately, you will see that the sexual union between Lila and Phaedrus is mystical. It's actually one of the best sex scenes I've ever read. It describes participatory knowing. And this is an example of choosing a lower quality pattern, biology over intellect, without sacrificing intellect, or over social, without actually sacrificing social. So do you see the difference? This is tough, and this is where I get hung up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that you're right, that in a way, the kind of bullshitting that we're seeing now in the political sphere, we've been prepared for that for the last 50 years. Like they've just been preparing us constantly. And I think that you experience it too. Like every time you give in to some passion, like whether it's eating your second piece of cake or whatever, there really is this idea, like, if you would stop and you would think of the effect it's going to have on you, like but there is a line to yourself. Like there is a if you focus on the piece of cake, right, and you focus on that, then it's like all the rest just vanishes. You just zoom into that, and so then you realize it afterwards. Then it's like you have this wake up. You have the wake up moment after you give it compassion. It's like, oh, okay, what did I just do? Why did I do that? and I mean, there is you really do feel like there's this slip into unconsciousness, right? You can feel it almost happening to you. you kind of just focus in on the desire, and then your consciousness just kind of slips and then smack.
Well, there's a lot of good cognitive science on this, but and maybe this will line up with your Eastern Orthodox anthropology, because Plato talks, right, about the tripart. Right, Plato was trying to figure out. I mean, that's the core. He's trying to understand why did they kill Socrates, and he comes up with this idea. He takes the phenomena of inner conflict as the core thing he wants to understand. How are people getting in, like eating the second piece of chocolate cake?
Over the last 50 years, you mean since Pirsig started pointing it out? So that second piece of cake is choosing biological at the sacrifice of social and intellectual patterns. You're driven towards the cake and all this other stuff vanishes, all the rest vanishes.
Right, and he gets the idea that we have that our cognition isn't sort of a monolith. There are different centers of functionality, and they have different phenomenologies and cognitive framing associated with. There's a part of us that's very stimulus bound, and it's very urgent, and it's designed to allow us to enable us to work with what's in the present moment, right here, right now, urgent. Yeah. You need that. If you try to eradicate that, you can't get out of bed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And then there's another part of us that's our cultural, right? That we are not just biologically shaped, we are culturally shaped. And then there's the part of us that is capable of abstract goals, right? And then Plato's point was, no, the problem is, right, you need to get these into alignment.
Here he's describing the static patterns, biological, social, and intellectual, all of which we still possess due to us being the product of evolution, due to us being layered on layer and layer of evolution. And by being in alignment for Pirsig, this would mean cultivating this meditative consciousness that can more readily detect quality, like how Pirsig pursued Zen meditation.
He discovered the meta-desire. In addition to whatever we desire it to be real. He also discovered the other meta-desire. In addition to whatever we desire to have it with peace of mind. We desire to have this internal alignment. So we're not at war with ourselves. Yeah. So that we have this, and his great insight, in my opinion, is the idea of anagoge, the ascent, that these can be linked together.
So I want to talk about Pirsig's insight into anagoge, and this is a quote from McWatt. Think about Plato's allegory of the cave of ignorance and escaping from it, so to see the sun of the good. Then compare it with the following quote. Not by its rising is there light, not by its sinking is there darkness, unceasing, continuous, it cannot be defined. The image of no thingness. Meet it and you do not see its face. Follow it and you do not see its back. So that's from the Tao Te Ching. It's on page 253 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. If you think about it long enough, then you'll see that there was no cave of ignorance until Plato put Western culture inside its metaphysical darkness for 2,400 years. Well, fortunately, Robert Pirsig eventually found a metaphysical torch to get us Westerners out of there. Nevertheless, Pirsig still had immense respect for Plato. At least Plato's prime subject area was the good, and that would explain how Vervaeke and Pirsig used the analytical knife differently in this regard. Vervaeke is also, as does Pirsig, seeing anagoge as something that we use the integration of Eastern and Western to connect with.
Part of the solution, the historical thing, is to understand, and I think you're seeing some of it right now. I think I'm a representative.
Right.
Of third generation Cogsci. This generation of Cogsci is trying to radically undermine that Cartesian grammar of disconnectedness. The mind isn't radically disconnected from the body.
So Vervaeke says, I am a representative. Yes, he is. Besides the third generation cognitive scientists, who we are very grateful for attempting this integration of science and spirituality, and let's say succeeding, there are other representatives of this transcendence into a new metaphysics as well, and certainly Killian Wilbur is one of these people, but there are others, and I will probably explore others later. I think Richard Rohr is one, I think Cynthia Pageau, there are others. And this is shifting, this is happening.
How do we fit back into this worldview?
How do we fit back into this worldview? Maybe with the metaphysics of quality?
I want to talk to you about it. I just ran an experiment on mystical experience and how it contributes to meaning in life. Mm-hmm. like the data is like, it's there.
So mystical experience, this is Poincaré, this is the flow state, this is the shift, this is the realization that ghosts have been haunting you. It's also in William James' work, which again deeply influenced Pirsig.
The Buddhism that's going to come out of this interaction with cognitive science is not going to look like the Buddhism right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're changing each other. Right? The sapiential, the cultivation, the wisdom practices within Buddhism, right? And the science within the cognitive science, they're changing each other. And what's going to come out on the other side, I don't know what it's going to look like.
I think this exactly reflects the shift to the next metaphysics.
I'm in agreement with you that I think something analogous is going to happen.
Something analogous is going to happen. Maybe the world will also rediscover Pirsig.
Taoism definitely, but that's for sure. Taoism is different. That might be
the way.
Exception.
Right? Pardon me?
I said it might be the exception but we're not. I don't know how Chinese we are in the sense that there is something very particular about Far East Asia, like a way of being that is.
Exactly. Remember what Carl Jung said. We cannot ever be completely Eastern if we're Western. It's ingrained in us. We evolved from this. It's in our collective unconscious. And, note that Vervaeke practices Lectio Divino and Neoplatonist practices along with his Taoism and Vipassana. And that makes sense.
Like this, Taoism is like swimming or making love. Right? You have to do the practice. You would say this.
Yeah.
You have said it. I've seen it in your.
Yeah.
You have to go into church. You have to do the liturgy. You have to recite with people. You have to do the Taoist practices. I've been doing them for 26 years. It gives you, you get an understanding. You get this perspectival, participatory understanding that isn't the same as having beliefs or assertion.
You do have to do the practice for transformation, at least most people do. Vervaeke has a great video about how to do Vipassana meditation, which I recommend. Also, look at Dr. Eric Dodson. I'll put a link below. Serendipitously, in the link that I'm going to include, Dodson mentions Pirsig. Dodson is emphasizing the need to practice. Both Vervaeke and Pageau take their practices very seriously, and for most of us, there's no other way. Transformation can be instant. You can have a transformative mystical experience like Eckhart Tolle, but for the most of us, it's kind of a slog. It's kind of practicing it, although the insight does come with an awareness that this is possible, I would say. But the other 999,999 have to practice.
The way that can be spoken of is not the way. If you try to lock it down into either one of those categories, you're missing that dynamic coupling that is so central to relevance realization that we've been talking about from the very beginning. I think Taoism is largely the religion of getting into the flow state. Mm-hmm. And we're doing increasing cognitive science about the flow state. And we know that the flow state is deeply conducive to people's sense of meaning in life. And the more people get into the flow state, the better they judge their life to be, independent of a lot of other variables. And I think Taoism plugs into that in a very powerful fashion.
That is detecting dynamic quality and relevance realization, getting into the flow state. If you have problems with the flow state, the Gumption Chautauqua in the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance should help you. And Gumption is analogous to the flow state. I did a video about this earlier, and I'll link to that. And it's in that flow state that you are connected with quality. There's no room for bullshit. Relevance realization is another way of putting this. Vervaeke's notion of relevance realization and Pageau's seem to really line up with Pirsig's.
I think of all of my work, all of my scientific work, all of my existential practices, all of my sapiential endeavors are all pointed towards getting this.
Okay.
If you want to put it that way. So, right? Because I think the ability, what we were talking about, we were disagreeing in some ways, agreeing in others, getting back to an enacted sacredness is ultimately the solution to the meaning crisis.
So getting to this enacted sacredness that means in the moment connection with dynamic quality. I love this term, enacted sacredness, that it's the connection that's sacred. And we are participating in this connection. So you see how much of this sort of relates.
how do I think this connects to relevance realization? I think it connects in some very fundamental ways. First of all, when I say relevance realization, the way I was talking about it, right, it's not only evolving, it's deeply involving. And what I mean by that is relevance realization isn't a cold calculation of where I should pay attention. It's about where you should pay attention. And you know what? You really care about where you pay attention. It's deeply affective to you. It is deeply engaging of your energies. It'll touch your central sense of agency.
So quality is what you care about. We learned this in Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's care. You have to care about the maintenance of your motorcycle. You can't be the sloppy mechanic.
The phenomenology of this relevance realization, right? It is much lower than the level of our sort of propositional thoughts, right? And our logical grammar. Think about it. You talk about this in, and was it the one on, you're doing the church and you're doing Jacob's Ladder?
It's sacred space in secular terms, I call it,
And you talk about this, and you even you indicate how there's sort of a preconceptual element to this, because you talk about this,
the finger pointing,
right. So think about demonstrative reference. Demonstrative reference, right? Any attempt to categorize things presupposes demonstrative reference. If I'm going to say, here I'm going to group these things together and say they're all cats. You know what I have to do first? I have to go this, this, and that's salience tagging. That's this initial relevance realization that it's pre-categorical. It allows you to create your categories.
The pre-categorical awareness, this that Vervaeke is talking about, this is dynamic quality. Dynamic quality is an event. It's the moment in pre-intellectual awareness where the subject recognizes the object, where you see the best fact. Poincaré. Remember the metaphor for the sexual union that Jonathan and other mystics like St. John of the Cross have used to describe this participatory knowing, which is what Vervaeke calls it. The meeting of heaven and earth. We see this theme repeated. Yes, it's evolving, and this has been the mechanism from the dawn of time, the mechanism of evolution, from the Big Bang up to now and beyond, not just creatures and human beings. This is inorganic patterns evolve. So everything is drawn toward the pursuit of what's better. And the universe is in fact created by quality, every last bit of it.
Overlapping, but deeper than is meant in transpersonal psychology. Relevance realization is pre-egoic. You emerge out of it. But at the same time, right, the world, as the combinatorial explosives, it is disclosed to you as an arena. It's like, and this is what relevance realization says, it's a way in which the world and the mind are coupled together so that they are mutually self-disclosing. Mutual self-disclosure is love.
It's like a sexual relationship. It's the meeting of heaven and earth.
That's a good point about transpersonal psychology. It's way deeper than that. Pageau said this earlier about unity and diversity at the same time. This is metaphysics. It's how anything gets made. It's how anything is created. It is literally the structure of reality.
Is we play with our capacity for relevance realization. Think about music. Music is pure, and think about how much we associate music with sacredness, because we're playing with this process, these coupling of these mysteries, the co-creation of our agency and the world, and the way in which music is kind of like moments of insight that are being triggered.
And it's like an ebb and flow. Like you move from insight towards question, towards insight, towards question.
Totally.
Motorcycle maintenance.
For true knowledge is really this idea of the we would say the nous in Orthodox.
And Platonism too, of course.
So this pre-ego capacity to intuit the world, and then it comes into contact with the created world, and then there's this unity, this possibility of the transfigured world, of a world that is full of, but it's also not static. It's dynamic, but it's constantly full of light.
So no comment necessary on that one. Let me close with a quote from Pirsig. When similarities of this sort exist, they can either be an odd coincidence or they can be an evidence that both systems of thought are describing something that is true independently of either thinker. Where the approaches are very different, each can sometimes throw a new light on the other. These theories all unite what should no longer be divided: reason and emotion, circular and linear time, heaven and earth. So I believe something like the metaphysics of quality is underlying the worldviews of both Jonathans and any worldviews that we can actually use at this point. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.